Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Number 11, Welham Square, by Herbert Stephen. We were sitting in the drawing-room of our house at Bayswater one evening after dinner, in high good humour. I had that day been appointed to a certain post at the British Museum, which would afford me ample opportunity for the studies in which I was most interested, and put me in possession of what I expected to find an ample competence. We had been talking over my prospects, and the only cloud I could discern upon the horizon was that I should have to be at my post at an earlier hour in the morning than was comfortably compatible with the 3-mile walk from our house to the museum. "What a pity," said my younger sister Patricia, "that we don't still live in the dear old house in Welham Square. You could have got to the museum from there in 5 minutes." I was born after we left Welham Square, but Patricia was 6 years my senior and could remember her nursery days there. "Not at all," said my father very abruptly. "The walk will do you all the good in the world." As the old gentleman had been, to all appearance, fast asleep for at least 10 minutes, I was rather surprised at the energy with which he spoke. Looking up, I saw my mother making anxious signals to Patricia, which she followed up by instantly changing the subject. A few days afterwards, as I descended reluctantly into the bowels of the earth at Edgware Road Metropolitan Station on the way to my new work for the first time, this episode recurred to my mind, and I began to speculate upon what might be the reasons that made the mention of Welham Square distasteful to my parents. I determined to consult my eldest sister Ellen on the subject, and from her, and some other sources, I gradually accumulated the facts, which I will present here in the form of a continuous narrative. Number 11 Welham Square has always been the freehold property of my family. It was built, together with several adjoining houses, about the beginning of the 18th century by the owner of a plot of land in which the houses stand, a retired attorney who had 2 nephews. These were Andrew Maisie, my great-great-great-grandfather, and his cousin Ronald Maisie. Ronald, who was generally thought to be his uncle's favourite and probable heir, was an exceedingly tall and powerful young man, with a forbidding and melancholy expression of countenance. As a boy, he was singularly backward, and his incapacity for mental exertion seemed to develop, as he grew up, into something not far removed from downright idiocy. His weakness of mind caused him to be remarkably subject to the influence of those with whom he lived, and in particular his cousin Andrew, my ancestor, was supposed to exercise over him an influence almost amounting to fascination, and to be able to mould him to all the purposes of an exceptionally vigorous will. Shortly after the building of the houses in what is now Welham Square, the uncle of these 2 men died, and Andrew took possession of all his property under the provisions, as he asserted, of a will, the existence of which no one except Ronald had any interest in disputing, and which no one except Andrew, the sole executor and devisee, ever saw. Shortly before his uncle's death, Ronald had become engaged to a young lady named Lettice White, to whom he was passionately attached, and it was generally supposed among the neighbours that upon his accession to the avuncular wealth the marriage would take place. But when a barely decent interval had occurred since the old gentleman's obsequies, the fair Lettice was led to the altar, not by the impecunious Ronald, but by his more fortunate cousin Andrew. The newly married pair took up their residence in number 11, and Ronald came to live with them. When it was represented to Andrew by some of his few intimate acquaintances that his arrangement was so singular as almost to be thought improper, he curtly gave them to understand that Ronald's mental condition was not such as to permit of his only living relation allowing him to live alone, and that he was compelled by the merest considerations of family affection to take the unfortunate young man into his own household. So the 3 lived on in the stately and somewhat gaunt mansion, Andrew collecting his rents with methodical regularity, and otherwise giving his neighbours but little concern. As for Ronald, there soon came to be little doubt in anyone's mind of his confirmed imbecility. He appeared seldom, and when he did, was for the most part silent, regarding his cousin and former betrothed with an expression of the profoundest submission, which at times merged into a look of wild and hardly human apprehension, like a terrified brute beast, as it was put by an old lady who was one of the few friends occasionally privileged to partake of the gloomy hospitality of this uncomfortable establishment. Nothing more was ever known of the condition in which my ancestor, his wife, and his cousin lived, and no one was specially interested when, about 6 years after the marriage, Ronald, who had not been seen for many months, died, and was buried in a frugal manner. Before he had been dead a year, Andrew and Lettice suddenly left their house and took up their abode elsewhere, and after a while a tenant was found for number 11. 30 years later, the lease of the house having expired, Andrew's son, who had succeeded to his father's property, came to reside there, but not for long. He left the house suddenly after a few years, and a rumour went abroad that it was haunted, probably by the ghost of the unfortunate Ronald. From this time, number 11 descended from father to son, the adjoining property being sold piecemeal as the family necessities dictated. Occasionally the successive freeholders made attempts to live there, but they never stayed more than a few months, and on each occasion of their removal the rumours of ghostly possession were renewed. These, however, would die away, and tenants would, after a time, be found who never suffered from any inconvenience. The last occupation by the owner was that of my father, who moved into the house when my sister Patricia was a little girl. After living there a year, he left precipitately, but Ellen could give me no particulars of his reasons for doing so, and knew only that he disliked any reference to the house, and never mentioned it himself. The house was now let to a stockbroker with a family. 2. 5 years had elapsed since the conversation I related at the beginning of the previous chapter. My parents had both died, and Patricia was married and living with her husband in a provincial town. My career at the museum had been a prosperous one, and I was now entrusted with a more responsible and better-paid office. The tenant of number 11 Welham Square had just given me notice of his intention to depart from it, and it occurred to me that it would be interesting to follow what seemed to be the family destiny, and try living in the house myself, to say nothing of the fact that it was admirably suited to my requirements. I felt fully capable of confronting any number of ghosts, and my wife was neither timid nor superstitious. Accordingly, at the beginning of the new year, we established ourselves with our 2 babies, and my sister Ellen, who lived with us in Welham Square, greatly delighted with the proximity of my work, with the solid masonry, spacious apartments, and roomy passages of our new abode, and with the remnant of 18th-century fashion and grandeur which seemed to pervade the neighbourhood. And in Welham Square we lived prosperously, without any kind of disturbance, for upwards of 6 months. In the course of July, my wife and the children left home to spend a couple of months at the seaside. I intended to join them when the time came to take my holiday, and in the meantime I stayed in London, going daily to my work. Ellen stayed on with me to keep house in the absence of her sister-in-law. One evening, 4 or 5 days after my wife's departure, I was sitting in my study, a large room with a door leading into the drawing-room, and a heavy curtain hung over my side of the door. It was past 11. My sister had retired half an hour before, and the 2 maids who were left in the house were presumably in bed and asleep. I was therefore surprised to hear heavy and somewhat slow footsteps, apparently those of a large man, ascending the stairs from the ground floor. The front door, I knew, was locked and chained, nor had I heard anyone ring. The steps paused for a moment on the landing outside my door, and then I heard the intruder proceed to go up the next flight of stairs leading to the bedrooms on the second floor. I sprang up, seized a candle, and opened the door. As I stood on the threshold of my room, I seemed to hear footsteps, as of a man heavily mounting the stairs at the top of the flight leading up from my door. But though I held the light above my head, I could see no one. Everything wore its usual aspect. I walked quickly up the stairs, but nobody was visible. I searched all the empty rooms, but with no result. I called up Ellen and the maids, but none of them had seen or heard anything. I am ashamed to say that I made a specially rigorous investigation of a large room at the back of the house, which we used for a night nursery, and which, tradition declared, to have been the abode of my ill-fated kinsman, Ronald Maisie. I then went downstairs and completed my search of the entire premises. Everything was in order, and at the end of an hour I went back to my study and my book, rather annoyed with myself for having spent so much time in so fruitless an exploration, and determined to think nothing more about the matter. It was the next night after this that I suddenly started up very wide awake, with a conviction that somebody was in my bedroom. I seemed to hear, still ringing in my ears, the sound of a long-drawn human sigh. I sat up, trembling with excitement, and looked about in the dim twilight of dawn in late July. I could see no one, but I did not feel alone. The feeling of suspense became unbearable. I jumped out of bed and walked with nervous determination to the window, where I turned round and faced the room, such light as there was being behind me. I saw no one. Again I walked across the room, and as I did so, I felt unmistakably that wave of air that meets one walking in the streets when someone on foot passes close to him in the opposite direction. I seemed to feel the light graze of a passing substance against my nightgown. I was dimly conscious of a faint, indescribable odour, calling up recollections of a life long but indefinably past. And while I stood fixed to the spot with surprise and horror, my heart beating violently, I heard distinctly 4 long, heavy steps passing from me towards the window. The floor creaked under their weight. The next instant I felt that I was alone, but it was not until long after the morning was as light as noon that I fell asleep again. I woke much troubled in mind, and doubting whether I should not, like my fathers, be compelled to leave this uncanny dwelling. But when in some measure restored by breakfast, I determined to say nothing to my sister at present, but to wait and see whether the situation would in any way develop itself. My resolution was fated to be put to the test sooner than I expected. I did not get home that evening until close upon dinner-time. When I entered the drawing-room, Ellen greeted me with, "Oh, Edward, what do you think has happened? Sykes is dead." Now, Sykes was a grey parrot belonging to my wife. He was so called because when he first came to us it was affirmed of him, perhaps rather libelously, that like the hero of Mr. Calverley's poem, he habitually swore. He certainly did from time to time blaspheme somewhat unreservedly. I was secretly not altogether sorry to hear of his demise, so I answered with much composure, "Did the cat eat him?" "No," said Ellen. "He died in the most horrible convulsions." I went up to get ready for dinner, thinking more of how to prevent my wife from replacing Sykes by another clamorous bird than of the manner of the lost one's death. But in the course of our meal it occurred to me that his fate was an odd one. "How did Sykes come to have convulsions?" I asked. "Why, it was most curious," answered Ellen. "I was going to tell you about it. I was in the drawing-room writing letters, and suddenly I heard a tremendous screaming and flapping, and I looked up, and there was Sykes turning over and over in the air, and pecking and clawing and flapping his wings, and screaming, and before I could get to him, he suddenly twisted his head right round 2 or 3 times, and tumbled down dead to the floor." "But do you mean," I said, "that he was carrying on these gymnastics up in the air?" "Yes. When I saw him, he was quite up above his cage, which was on the little table, and in his struggles he must have wrung his own neck. That seems rather remarkable. Yes, and another remarkable thing was that he must have opened the door of his cage and got out all by himself, which I never heard of his doing before, because I had been feeding him with cake after lunch, and I know that the door was fastened then. I found it open when he was dead. Had he been out long? No, he must have been seized almost directly he got out, because it so happened that about 5 minutes before he began to scream, I fancied I heard the door open, and looked up to see if anyone was coming in, and no one was there, but I happened to see the parrot, and he was in his cage, just as usual. "Well," I said, "I suppose he's dead, and there's an end of it, but this is a very singular catastrophe. I hope Marion won't be inconsolable." During the rest of dinner, I was conscious of being rather poor company. Following close upon the mysterious occurrences I have described, Sikes's unhappy fate troubled me. My suspicions were, however, so undefined, and seemed even to me, when I tried to contemplate them from an impartial point of view, so ridiculous, that I could not bring myself to communicate them to Ellen, and incur the contempt which would be the deserved portion of a grown-up man who confessed to being seriously disturbed by an odd sound in an empty house, and by a commonplace nightmare. I have no hesitation in revealing these sentiments now that subsequent events have justified them, but that evening I again determined to wait. I did not have to wait long. It was a cold evening, and after bidding good night to my sister, I lighted a fire in my study and sat down to enjoy a new novel I had long been wishing to read. I was about halfway through my volume when I suddenly felt a sensation of cold. I looked up. The fire was burning brightly, but I did not feel its warmth. It was as though some opaque body or a large glass screen had been interposed between me and it. A moment afterwards, I felt the heat fall upon my face again. Had I heard the muffled sound of a footstep on the hearth-rug close to me? I put out my hand and felt nothing but the warmth of the fire. As I gazed about the room in surprise, my eye fell on an armchair standing on the other side of the fire. It was a nearly new chair which I had bought shortly after coming to Welham Square. It had a leather seat, smooth and unworn, with particularly good and yielding springs. Hung upon its back was an antimacassar, worked aesthetically in crewels. As I looked at this chair, it struck me that the seat was considerably depressed, as though someone had recently sat down upon it, and the seat had failed to resume its ordinary level. This surprised me, for I had sat in the chair that morning, and felt sure the springs then had been in good order. I looked at the antimacassar. Towards the top it was pushed up in wrinkles. As I looked, it occurred to me that it was impossible for it to hang in such a manner by itself. It looked for all the world as if an invisible but substantial human frame was then actually sitting in the chair. When this notion occurred to me, I sat dazed with an indescribable horror, staring stupidly at the chair, which did not move. In an access of frenzied terror, I hurled the book I was reading at the chair. Did it strike the seat, or did it glance away a few inches from the edge and fall on the hearth-rug? The next instant the seat of the chair rose up audibly to its normal level, and the antimacassar fell out into its usual folds, still preserving, however, the traces of its previous wrinkles. I started up and, rushing to the chair, began to prod it. I could discover nothing unusual in its condition. As I was doing so, I felt a hand, beyond all doubt, laid steadily on my shoulder. I faced around and saw nothing. "Who are you?" I shouted. "What do you want?" But no answer came. I was alone. I sat cogitating till 1 o'clock, and then I went to bed. Just as I was getting into bed, it occurred to me that perhaps I might be annoyed in the dark, and though I had not yet seen anything, the prospect seemed rather awful, and with a slightly trembling hand I lighted a nightlight. When I had done so and got into bed, I was rather disposed to be ashamed of myself, and thought I would put it out, but partly, no doubt, from a disinclination to get out of bed, I determined that in any case it would do no harm, and that I would leave it as it was. It occurred to me what an odd thing it is that one feels safer in bed than anywhere else, whereas, in fact, one is never in a more defenceless situation. Then I went to sleep. I do not know what time I woke. It seemed to me that the air was blowing in upon my chest, where the bedclothes should have covered me up, and, yes, certainly, there was a cold depression on my pillow, close in front of my face, as if some heavy weight were pressing it down. I put up my hand to investigate. I touched something on the pillow. I caught hold of it, and turned cold with terror, for I held tightly in my hand another hand, neither cold nor warm, but large and solid. My light was still burning, and there was no one to be seen. The hand was suddenly jerked away from me. I sprang out of bed and rushed to the fireplace with a despairing feeling that someone followed close behind me. I seized the poker, turned round, and struck wildly at the air. Whether I hit anything or not, I do not know. I remember only that as I was recovering myself from a frantic lunge at nothing, I received a sharp and stunning blow on the back of my head. When I came to myself, it was 6 a.m, and I was lying on the floor where I had fallen. The night light was out, and the morning sunlight was streaming in at my window. There was a very large and painful bruise where I had been struck. 3. I felt that this was getting beyond a joke. It was all very well to frighten me, but when my ghostly enemy took to knocking me down like a 9-pin, I was not going to keep it to myself any longer. I had no intention of surrendering, for the blood of the Maisies was up, and the fact that each of my ancestors since the house was built had sooner or later evacuated the premises made me all the more determined not to be driven away without making some further resistance. So I revealed to my sister Ellen the whole of my experience in the matter. She was decidedly sceptical about the ghost, if ghost it could be called, and suggested that I was not well. I vowed that I was as well as any man with a great hole in the back of his head could be, and she consented to the arrangement that I proposed, that she should sit up for a night or two in the drawing-room while I was in my study with the door open between us, and that if any remarkable incident occurred, I should call her in. In order not to be wholly without male assistance in case I should be attacked, I invited a college friend of mine named Prescott, a strong, sensible, and energetic young doctor who lived near us, to keep my sister company in the drawing-room. He, when he heard my story, was, as befitted a scientific young professional man, exceedingly facetious at my expense, but he willingly consented to share our watch and to sleep in the house. That evening I sat up as usual in my study, while Prescott and Ellen beguiled the hours in the drawing-room with light literature until about 2:30, when, nothing having occurred, we settled to go to bed and separated. Prescott, divided between high spirits at the temporary triumph of incredulity and a tinge of disappointment at the non-occurrence of anything in the shape of a row, and Ellen rather indignant with me for having kept her up so long to no purpose. After the stormy experiences of the 2 preceding nights, I thoroughly enjoyed an unbroken sleep. I prevailed upon my sister and my friend to give the ghost one more chance, and the next evening saw us again comfortably established in the 2 rooms, separated only by the curtain which hung over the door of communication. It may have been 11 o'clock when I heard a board creak just behind my chair. Uttering a shout, I sprang up and dashed at the spot from which the noise had come. I came into heavy contact with what felt like a gigantic human figure. Prescott and Ellen hurried into the room, and beheld me wildly grappling, apparently with nothing at all. "By Jove," said Prescott, "he's got them." Them, I believe, meant some kind of hallucinations upon which Prescott professed to be an authority, but I was struggling furiously with my unseen antagonist, and had no breath for explanations. "Seize him! Seize him!" I cried. At that moment my prey burst from me, hurling me with prodigious violence across the room. Prescott rushed forward, and as he did so was tripped up by what he afterwards described as a heavy kick from an unseen foot, and sent sprawling on the floor. Fortunately, I was prostrate at the other end of the room, and could not be suspected of having had a hand or foot in this outrage. As we struggled to our feet, while Ellen stared wildly about, we all heard 2 or 3 hurried steps, as of a man running. There was a tremendous crash, and all was still. But the curtains had swung violently back into the window, and the window itself, plate glass, frame and all, was burst clean away outwards. Prescott was white as a sheet, and the sensible and strong-minded Ellen was actually crying, which impressed me more than anything else in the scene. "Let us leave this horrible house," she said. "Something worse will happen if we stay." But I was filled with an unreasonable kind of courage at having, as it seemed, put our inexplicable visitor to flight, and I was, besides, conscious of a certain degree of pride in the assurance that Prescott had been converted, and would hardly talk again about my having got them. "We can't go tonight," I said, "and as our gentleman seems to have taken himself off for the present, we had better consider what's to be done next. I'm sure Prescott wants to stay and investigate the phenomenon." We shut the shutters over the wreck of the window, and sat talking over the event until late at night. By degrees I contrived to infuse into my companions some of my courage, and at last, no further disturbance having taken place, we all went to bed in pretty good spirits. I placed a loaded double-barrelled pistol on the table by my bedside, thinking that if a ghost could be struggled with, he ought to be able to be shot, and Prescott placed within reach a large bowie knife, which he had brought back from America, and had long been wishing for any opportunity to make use of it. When I woke, I thought my last hour had come. My throat was tightly grasped by 2 extremely strong hands. A crushing weight was on my chest. I tried to shout, but could not. I was rapidly being strangled, and as I lay writhing, my eyes, forced half out of their sockets, glared through the light of the night-light at the opposite wall, which looked precisely as usual, except that, as the squeezing of my throat grew more and more intolerable, my view of the room slowly darkened. But of the horrible and only too palpable form that was killing me, I could see no trace. In unavailing despair, I clutched at the iron wrists that held me down. In another moment, I believe, I should have become unconscious. Then a last gleam of hope, the thought of my pistol, flashed through my mind. I stretched out my hand, and as I lay, I could just reach the end of the barrel. I drew it towards me, and with an expiring effort pushed the muzzle of it close against what I took to be the invisible body of my tormentor, and fired. We never found the bullet, or any trace of it afterwards. Instantly the hands relaxed their grip on my throat a little, and with a violent effort I wrenched my neck away. Then a heavy body fell sideways from my bed to the ground, and I fell too, grappling with it. At that moment Ellen and Prescott, who had been aroused by the sound of the shot, burst into the room. There they saw me struggling, partly on the floor and partly kneeling, apparently on space. They rushed to my assistance. Both of them felt the thing. Both of them grappled with it. The struggles of our enemy became fainter. Managing to get one hand free, I repossessed myself of the pistol which had fallen on the floor, and emptied the second barrel into what I judged to be the breast of the spectre. I fired straight downwards, apparently at the floor, but of that bullet we saw no more than of the other. Meanwhile, Prescott stabbed furiously with the bowie knife, and each time he dashed the blade down, its progress was arrested before it reached the carpet. Then the struggles ceased, and nothing was heard except our rapid panting. We were all kneeling on and holding down what looked like space, and felt like the form of a tall and athletic man. "We've done for it, whatever it is," I said, hoarsely. Prescott burst into a foolish giggle. "By Jove," he said, "we'll make a cast of it and see what it's like." As he spoke, the form of our victim was agitated by a desperate convulsion which shook us all off. Before we could seize it again, a deep groan burst from the place where we had held it, and the word "lettuce" rang through the room in a tone of sepulchral melancholy. Then there was silence. I threw myself on the floor, not, as I had intended, on the prostrate figure. We searched the room and then the house, but we could find absolutely nothing. Nor from that day to this has anyone, to the best of my knowledge, seen, heard, or felt anything whatever of this ghastly being. After much consideration, we determined to keep the adventure to ourselves, for a time at any rate. Indeed, it was only last summer, when we had lived in the house for a good number of years without any kind of ghostly interruption, that I described the circumstances herein narrated to my wife. She doesn't believe them, and I'm sorry I told her. Was it the ghost of Ronald Maisie? Did it voluntarily depart and leave us alone because it considered that the annoyances it had inflicted upon my ancestors and me were sufficient, and that the tale of its vengeance upon our house for the wrongs, whatever they were, inflicted upon Ronald in his lifetime by Andrew and Lettice was complete? Or did we actually kill it? Perhaps we did. He was a poor, weak creature when he was alive.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
He was a poor, weak creature when he was alive. He was a poor, weak creature when he was alive. He was a poor, weak creature when he was alive. I just enjoyed saying that. I did a number of takes of the end. I thought it was rather over the top, but see what you think, because it's your opinion that counts anyway. That was number 11, Welham Square by Sir Herbert Stephen. And as this is the commentary part, I'm going to tell you a little story a bit later. What I try to do is I have an idea and I think, no, keep your narrative. Don't go off on a tangent yet. And I think I'm going to save it. And I'm always very conscious I'm going to forget it. So all the time I'm then keeping to my narrative, I'm not really keeping to my narrative because my words are coming out of my mouth related in a half-hearted way because they're not fully engaged with my thoughts, if you know what I mean. And the thought is thinking, remember this, remember this, remember this, remember this. And then I'm looking for an opportunity to say it. So I should really just go off on a tangent. I've had to open a window because unusually it is warm here. It's 28.6 degrees in this room. Windows are open, breeze, motorbikes. Scrapman is not making a lot of noise right now. He must be sick or something. I haven't heard him all day. So it's been a pleasant day. I've been with took the old dogs out for about 4.5 miles, I think it was. And then I went to my personal trainer, Ryan. We talked about various things he makes me do. I said to him, so how come it gets harder every week? He says, that's how it works, mate. We discussed our mutual dislike of fish. Neither of us really like fish. I kind of like chip shop fish because it doesn't really taste like fish. If anything tastes of fish, I don't like it. And he says he likes sushi, and I said, well, that's weird. He says, because it doesn't really... He didn't actually say that. I said, is it because it doesn't taste like fish? And he said, well, I don't know. I just like it. Anyway, back to the story. Let me tell you something about, because I've forgotten the point I was going to mention now, of course, of Sir Herbert. So Sir Herbert Stephen, born June 25th. Yesterday! It was his birthday yesterday. It's Sheila's birthday today. We're going out to Alexandros tonight, to the Greek restaurant. You may have guessed that. And it'll be nice, and I'll dress up for her. I'll put a shirt on. No trousers. No, that's a joke. I will wear trousers and perhaps a jacket, a light summer jacket. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I remembered. And it was my accent avatar. And I'm not totally consistent with this, but when I do a Glaswegian, I'm aiming for Kevin Bridges, always. And also Las Vegas. They've got a song about, you don't want to stab me, you don't know my family and their capabilities. So I was in Glasgow on Friday last and Saturday. I love Glasgow. Everybody's really nice to me in Glasgow when they're sober. I don't really drink as much, not really much at all, so I didn't go out for a drink, so I didn't encounter any drunken people. But everybody was sober. It was absolutely lovely. I'm not saying there was a lot of drunken people. I didn't see anybody drunk, so I don't really think that. Oh God, I've just offended the whole city, and despite the fact I really like Glasgow. I didn't mean to. Anyway, so Kevin Bridges is my avatar for my Glaswegian accent, and I was wondering who was my avatar for my posh accent, and I think it's Douglas Murray, and I don't think I've quite got him because he's got a bit more of a lisp. I could have done Boris Johnson, lots of this in Seneca, and Seneca. Well, the thing is, I could have done that, but I don't think that works. So I think certainly number 11, Welham Square, was written by Sir Herbert Stephen under the pseudonym. I noticed when I listened back to my words that some of my vowels drop. So, I need to lift the E up, because in posh English, all the vowels are lifted. Cat, wonder, not wonder, wonder. So I need to remember to do that, because I notice I drop that sometimes, assiduously. Yeah, so yeah, I'm going to keep watching Douglas Murray videos so I can master his accent. He's very angry about things, but he puts it in a very eloquent way. So, and for American, just to balance politically, I should do Noam Chomsky. I do a bit of muttering. Yeah. So perhaps not. We haven't even got to talk about the story. We started at the beginning talking about Sir Herbert Stephen, not Sir Humphrey Appleby. When I was searching for details about Sir Herbert Stephen, I kept coming up with Sir Humphrey Appleby from Yes Minister, but they're not the same person. So there he was, and it's his birthday yesterday. He would have been. I don't know if I can even calculate this. So he was born in 1857. So to take him to the end of the century, that would be 53. So that's to 1900. So to 2000, he's 153. So then we had 20, so 173, and we had 4, so he's 177 yesterday. His main career, he was born into a legal erudite family. His father, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, what a name, was an eminent judge and philosopher, and his uncle, Sir Leslie Stephen, was the first editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. I am not yet in that, and I may never be. I've got to reconcile myself to that. Setting a high standard within a family for both academic and literary excellence. He was educated at Rugby and Trinity College, Cambridge. Now, there's a story that says he was educated at Eton and King's College. That's not true. That's M.R. James. Herbert Stephen distinguished himself in the study of law, became a barrister at the Inner Temple in 1881. Isn't that great, the Inner Temple? He was appointed as clerk of the assize for the Northern Circuit, good lad, a position he held from the 1889 to 1927. I've got another digression. This might be a long one, but hopefully I'll be able to hook it back at the end and rejoin seamlessly, so you will hardly notice if I hadn't told you that we were going on a little bit of a journey. So, I've got these 3 channels. I've got 4 actually on YouTube, and 3 podcasts. One is ghosts, second is detectives, third is literature. So I've just been doing some stories by Stefan Zweig, and here's another one. Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, I'll come back to him. And I did Vladimir Nabokov. Some absolutely fantastic stories. So, and YouTube has said, interesting, this is a digression upon a digression, YouTube has said that they're not going to allow me to monetize because I don't bring anything to them. Okay, you what? Anyway, I've decided not to be splenetic about it, and just kind of, and do you know what they mean by that? because I decided, after having some very unpleasant comments about my commentaries, and I was wounded, I was really hurt, I've overcome it now, I didn't do them on those, particularly because I thought people who are interested in literature are going to be really snobbish, aren't they? And be, oh, blah, 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 I'm professor of blah, blah, and you got a full stop wrong, and your opinion of this is trash. And I'm like, yeah, all right, pal. But YouTube says, we want your commentaries. And I'm like, well, if YouTube want my commentaries, who are you, pipsqueaks? So there's going to be commentaries on all those, and it's going to be the wisdom and wit, both of which are in short supply, of Tony Walker about literature. So that, yeah, it was funny. YouTube wanted them, despite, anyway, I did a D.H. Lawrence story, and if you know anything about D.H. Lawrence, he was son of a miner from Nottinghamshire, just outside Nottingham. And so he was a my grandfather was a miner, so I'm kind of closer to G.H. Lawrence than I am to Vladimir Nabokov. But some geezer said, the reader's bass, vibrato, and regional accent made it unintelligible. Like, seriously, man? Even if I speak like proper Northern, you still can understand me. I can understand people from Alabama and Melbourne and Skibbereen. So actually, it's a push with Skibbereen. But and Glasgow sometimes, although sometimes not. Mostly I get Glasgow accents. One time we were going to see Heilung, a German Norwegian band, at the Barrowlands Ballroom. And we parked, and I wasn't sure if this was a public parking place. There was a guy in a high-vis jacket sitting down. I may have told this story. And I said to him, is this public parking? Will it be open? And he said something to me, and no, I didn't. He had the broadest accent. And so Limmy owns this. I didn't understand what he was saying at all. You'll know who Limmy is, maybe. If you don't, look him up, he's funny. Yeah, I didn't understand him. So I don't believe this bloke. And then I'm going to tell you something. I'm not a psycho. I'm not a psycho. I'm trying to convince myself of this. And what happened was, he had his profile picture on his comments, so I clicked on it. Indignantly, I should say. And there he was, sitting there, a bloke. And I want to tell you this. He was wearing jeans and trainers, that's sneakers to Americans, and had a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge behind him. And I'm like, okay, I can't believe he's American. I don't think an American would have said that. They're too polite. So I'm taking he's British. If he's American, what the hell does he know about regional accents? No offence. But you'll admit that's true, isn't it? There are very few Americans. Gwyneth Paltrow, maybe, she did a good one. And various people on Game of Thrones, they were excellent. And in The Hobbit, they were excellent as well. The ones doing the British accents, you wouldn't have known. And Jenny Lane, she's brilliant. Jenny Lane does a fantastic English accent that you wouldn't know that she wasn't from the south of England. And she lives in San Francisco. I hope she doesn't mind me telling people. But it's a big city, unlikely. She just voiced, apart from me in the latest Ashridge, she plays the publican, the owner of the pub, Susan Devant, with a weird French name. I don't know where I got that from. Devant. I don't know, it just popped out of my head, as many things do, and pop out of my gob and all. And anyway, so this guy's sitting there in his jeans. I'm like, listen, if you're trying to be posh, you don't sit in your jeans and your trainers on a tyre or whatever he's sitting on. I won't give you his name, but I took umbrage. Where does that leave us? Oh yeah, Douglas Murray, we talked about that. I don't know. Let's talk about the story. So mainly, yeah, so Herbert Stephen was mainly, he got a Sir for being a clerk of the Northern Assize. He must have hung a lot of people or been involved in the hangings of a lot of people. Anyway, 11 Square was written by him. It was published in the Cornhill magazine in 1885 under the pseudonym Edward Maisie, so he's pretending it's a true story. He Illustrations by George du Maurier. Now, I remember being in Hampstead last year, and there's a cafe in Hampstead now, an exhibition of the du Maurier family, including Daphne du Maurier is one of my heroes. I think she's a fantastic writer, and yeah, he's one of them as well. George du Maurier, the illustrator, but of a different generation, obviously. So let's talk about the story. So it's actually well written. The other thing, if you read the obituary of Sir Herbert Stephen, which I did from the Times in 1930 odd, he was a correspondent to the newspapers and very erudite on legal matters, and apparently a great prose master. This story, if you think about the construction of it, three parts. Really, he's a young boy, and he introduces the story. He hints at it, lovely bit of foreshadowing. We don't get the details, and then he says he purports to have collected this and pretends to be Edward Maisie. So he's trying to. I mean, of course, it's a double bluff. It's a literary device. Nobody really probably thought he was Edward Maisie, and he knew they didn't. So it's like it's performative, isn't it? It's like we all know. It's like when you say something to somebody, it's not actually the words you say the meaning. They're performing. How are you? You don't actually care. Or not a bad day today. These are Britishisms. Well, it might or it might not be, but it's not. You're not actually doing it because you care about the weather. You're doing it to create a greeting. So you're using the words to perform a social role, which has nothing to do with the actual words. And I suppose this is the case. He knew most probably that nobody really would imagine he was Edward Maisie. So there we are. I'll just throw that in. And then, so the first chapter is about that, and then he collects the historical stuff. And two things to say. One is the classic Gothic haunted house. We want them. We love them. I'm going to tell you a little thing, a trick I've got. And this is a true thing. When I use a thumbnail picture of a haunted house, I get double or triple the listens. Crackers, isn't it? Doesn't matter what the story is. The second feature is the title, but the thumbnail of a haunted house, I could put a picture of a person or of something else relevant to the story. The haunted house picture sells the episode. It's a true thing. Why? It's just psychology. So yeah, we love a haunted house, a goth, and it's Gothic, isn't it? It goes back to the 18th century. It's described. It's all creaky. It's dark and shadowy. It's got lots of stairs and rooms and all of that. Gothic. So, and the second thing is, of course, the thing you need in a ghost story is the sin. You need a sin to explain why the ghost has come to. In most cases, ghosts seek to right wrongs. This is, in a sense, it is, and he says that at the end, that this Maisie lad who was slow, and basically, it's a safeguarding issue. It wouldn't be these days. He was abused, really, by his relatives, exploited, and he's come back to get his revenge on the family. And they were like cousins, so obviously there's, your cousin isn't your family. Well, I think your cousin is your family, but it obviously to them, So the sin is that exploitation and abuse of the lad, and the ghost has come back to right the wrongs. And then the next thing is we have the build-up of he always going into the house, and it's a lovely plausible reason. He set it up at the beginning. Remember, you've got to set these things up for them to be believed. So if I've said this many times, if you set it up and then reveal 2 sentences later, the readers go, oh yes, swizz. But if you set it up at the very beginning and then you reveal it 30 pages later, readers go, all right. Absolutely works. It's a little trick, but it works. So if you're going to foreshadow far ahead. The further ahead you foreshadow, the cleverer your reader thinks you are. You're not. It's just a technique, but they fall for it every time, like the thumbnail. And so yes, we set that up. I forgot what I was saying. The sin is punished. Yeah. The middle bit is the ghostly, and that was quite scary a bit. And then at the end, we lapse into Victoriana. And for these late Victorian stories, they'd got tired of the Gothic. Jane Austen had made fun of the Gothic in Northanger Abbey a bit earlier, so it was a people didn't take them seriously. It's like vampire stories these days. After Twilight, you've got to work really hard to get a vampire story that people will take seriously. I'll just cough a little bit here and say I have my Unreal City, which of course does exactly that. So if you haven't heard my Unreal City audiobook, just search for it and you'll love it. If you like vampire stories, it's a good one. Everybody says so. My mum used to say so. She didn't. She never read it. Nobody in my family ever reads my work. None of my family ever read my work. They just go, that's nice. You know, I'm not complaining. Well, yes, I am, I suppose. But yeah, anyway, where were we? So we get to the end, we have the Victorian yarn. So what I'm saying is they'd become sick of the supernatural. And in many cases, the stories turn out not to be. They turn out to be Scooby-Doo situations. They're not really supernatural. It's some kind of scam going on. This is supernatural. He doesn't go quite as far as that to debunk it, but it becomes like an adventure story, doesn't it? And I think if we place him, we have Dickens and Le Fanu and early to mid Victorian, and we have Elizabeth Gaskell's Gothic stories, early Victorian. Then we have kind of people who are mid Victorian, so a bit earlier than this, but a couple of decades earlier than this. But people like Amelia Edwards. And then we have Charlotte Riddell, and we have things like The Phantom Coach and The Open Door. There are two. Margaret Oliphant did the Scottish version of that, which is probably a better story. But the Charlotte Riddell Open Door is still good. And they turn out to be, wheezes. You know, somebody, some criminal or something is trying to, so, and you know, it gets, so it isn't, if you think of M.R. James, can you imagine M.R. James getting enough, his heroes getting in a fist fight, or drawing a Bowie knife or a Bowie knife? Somebody will complain about me saying Bowie, they absolutely will, and drawing a Bowie knife or a gun and shooting the ghost. M.R. James is not going to do it. I don't think even Sheridan Le Fanu does it. Early generation, before it became so hackneyed, and M.R. James brings it back to the supernatural. But this little piece, and even Dickens's stories, his ghosts are, with the exception of the Ghost of Christmas Future, yet to come, I don't think they're really scary. Marley's a little bit scary, but and you know, the goblins who stole the sexton and all that kind of stuff that he does. I do a Christmas story of Dickens every year, so at Christmas. So, but we lapse into the we're not really scared of you ghosts kind of thing. And I think that's what happens in the third chapter. This becomes a yarn. It becomes, and then, as I said, later on, the ghost story is rescued in the early 20th century by the psychological ghost story. I mean, we haven't mentioned, of course, The Turn of the Screw, Henry James, where he really brings home the psychology and makes it really scary again. And then Robert Aikman going into the weirdness. But a whole bunch of people very late, I suppose Edwardian going forward, they make it scary again. But in this period when Sir Herbert Stephen's writing, they are lapsing into the rumbustious ones, and I think a bit like the Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes stuff. The Hound of the Baskervilles is a good example of this. It could be supernatural. It's put out as supernatural, but it is debunked. I've done the Hound of the Baskervilles. I love doing it. If you haven't heard my version of the Hound of the Baskervilles, please go and listen to it, because just please, I can't think of any good reason. I mean, I hope you enjoy it, but I was going to say because it's great, but I enjoyed doing it. I think it's all right. I think I did a good job. But, you know, you will be the judge of that. It's underserved. It's under-listened to, I think. Also, The Phantom of the Opera. That was fantastic to do. Go and listen to that. Listen, if you take all my suggestions now, you'll be listening for 4 weeks and you won't be doing anything else. You won't peel the potatoes, you won't take the dog for a walk, you won't go out for a meal on your partner's birthday, which I am. So anyway, that's probably all I want to say. I hope you're all right. Nip over to my classic literature stories channel. There's some absolutely knock your block off stories there. Honestly, stories that have really moved me, and you can see, I'm going to sound like one of them snobs I was decrying earlier. You can see, I love a good ghost story, clearly. I love a good detective story. But those really speak to humanity, those literary stories. And I think that's why I used to slag them off, didn't I? I used to say, well, I think then later in the later 20th century, the literary novel became just, as I say, you know, some angst-ridden story about rather neurotic person spending a rainy weekend in Dinan in Brittany, thinking about his past and the loves he lost. And they're fairly dull. But yeah, no, when it's done well, it's done well. It's just doing it well, isn't it? Not everybody's as clever as they think they are, including me. Do I think I'm clever? Oh, well, whatever I think, I'm not as clever as I think I am, and that's a rule of thumb. I just sit on my desk here. I don't know if you buy anything from Temu. You probably shouldn't. I hope they don't block me, but they send me all these, and they've got all these fantastic things, and they're like tuppence. They take 7 years to come from China, but when they do come, you look at them and you think, yeah, that's not very good quality, really. But I've got this coin they sold me, which is actually quite nice. It's a big coin, it's the size of an old crown, a half crown, something like that. It's big, silver, metal, and it has a yes on one side and no on the other. And you throw it, you get the idea. You toss the coin, it tells you whether you should or shouldn't do things like cross the road, yes, no, well, okay, I'm here. Go for a meal with Sheila, yes, no, that could lead me into a lot of trouble. So I have used it a little bit, but I'm actually pretty good at making decisions. Snap, foolish decisions that I later come to regret. I actually don't regret them. Usually don't regret them. I'm just like really impulsive, as you can tell. Need two shots of Ritalin just to calm me down. Anyway, I better go. He was a weak fellow. When alive, I've forgotten the line now. I looked it up, here's the pirate version. He were a poor weak creature when he were alive. And my final point is, somebody actually put a comment that made me laugh. Tony Walker, he was brilliant at the start, but he's gone bonkers now. As if.
Everybody dies, don't they? Some come back, don't they? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?